Welcome everybody, the Open Data Track and our panel on open data across industries. My name is Lee Fulmer. I have worked in financial services for 20 years. I've worked in data for 30. And over the last 20, I've very much had a penchant for trying to figure out how within banking we can be more collaborative. To Nick's point, a lot of the data is not competitive in terms of reducing our overheads, right? How can we reduce the data centers, the storage, and use common sources of data? I started to get the idea that there was possibly a way to do this across industry, which is how I wound up meeting my colleague Ian, who I will let him introduce himself in a second, who works in the energy sector, and then was introduced to Nick, who works in regulation. So you've got three very different people, all with a data background, looking at ways to push this forward. And what we really kind of want to do is engage with the community to figure out how can we make that happen. So I guess with that, would you mind introducing yourself, Ian, telling everybody a little bit?
Good morning, and thank you, Lee. So my name is Ian Betts. I work for Shell. I'm the General Manager for Open Data Platforms. That's a sort of an indication of how Shell sees data and digital in the future of energy. We believe it's digital and collaborative. And so I'm very fortunate in my role that I get to lead and engage one of the significant open source communities in the energy industry. It's called the OSDU Forum. We bring together almost all the large companies who operate in the industry, so the Shells, the BPs, the ExxonMobils, but also the tech industry, so Microsoft, Google, AWS, SLB, Halliburton, all the oilfield service providers. In total, it's more than 200 companies. So it's like trying to organize an open source community of very large organizations, and it can be like herding cats. But we do it because we believe there is value in building common foundations, and using open source and open source software to do that is a way that we believe can make a real difference. So we'll explore some of the connections with the things you heard about from Nick earlier, hopefully today. But lots of good stuff that I heard this morning as well, which really gives me hope that we can use open source and open source technology as a way to make a difference to the energy industry.
So, Nick, I know we all just saw you, but for those who didn't, could you maybe take a couple of minutes and just give us your background and why you're interested as well?
Sure. So my background's confused. I'm a chartered accountant by trade. I know the dark side, right? So I'm a blended CIO and CFO, which you don't come across very often. The consistency for me of those two roles is data and using data to make better decisions. Now, whether that's in the financial sense or whether that's in the kind of rock and map sense that I was just talking about. And I think the data industry has been around for a long time, and lots of people are using data in their roles. So in terms of those that are just joining us, as my day job, I'm a CIO and CFO for the North Sea Transition Authority. We regulate and influence oil and gas, carbon storage, and hydrogen. Alongside that, I'm also a board member for a charity called CAST, who are the Centre for the Acceleration of Social Technology. If you're working in the charity sector and you haven't come across them, worth looking them up. They do a lot on open source, particularly on the technology side, but also on the data side. And I think when we're talking about, on the panel now, about similarities between industries, I think you'll find that whether that's the financial sector, whether that's the charity sector, regulation, energy, there are a lot more similarities than there are differences.
So I think one of the things that powered the idea behind this panel originally was this idea that there are examples in every industry where you can look at the data that is there, that we all treat and ring fence and wrap our arms around, but that actually could be opened up broadly within the industry and potentially beyond it. So again, most recently I was the Chief Data Officer for UBS Investment Bank, and I saw it constantly, whether it was sanctions data on what countries or what legal entities you should do business with, routing information, so the sort code and account numbers or the BICs and IBANs for your bank account. None of that data is really proprietary, and it's all distributed out there by various organizations, but everybody keeps taking a copy of it, and the copies change all the time. You have version control problems. And at last year's conference, I spoke about the opportunity for the open source community to help disrupt banking by taking away a lot of these things that aren't competitive. And that was kind of the genesis of how this idea developed for me. and actually why Amanda Brock asked me to join the Finance Advisory Board for Open UK. So I'm trying to now be the ex-banker in the room, trying to help disrupt the bankers with everybody who's in this room. And I do feel that it should extend beyond my industry or my ex-industry into things like energy or into things like regulation. So for instance, one thing you have to do in financial services is always be able to say who you're transacting with, whether it's a natural person, which is all of us in the room, or what's called a legal entity, which is a company structure. So for argument's sake, Ian in his role has a ton of information that's of interest to me around Shell and its legal entity structure and all the different holding companies and everything around the world. Now, if he could make that available not just to me, but to all the people in banking, and again, even to the regulators, it becomes a much easier exercise for us all to know that when we are talking to company A, that it actually is company A, and that we have the right contacts and the right details and the right constructs. Likewise, for Ian, to know when he is trying to share data with Nick, to know that he is talking to the right government department and that they have the right taxonomies and the right information and that they will safeguard the information within, as you pointed out, the framework of confidentiality as and when needed. So all of this stuff does really tie together. I think, Ian, if I can kind of pass to you, I'd be really interested, and I'm sure the group would as well, in what sorts of data sets that you've got or that you see that have that opportunity to be shared across energy and outward.
Thanks, Lee. So I think there's a really tricky dilemma that we're trying to grapple with, where the question that was asked of Nick, there's certainly some data which we're not going to share because it is commercially sensitive. For example, you may have seen announcements recently about different oil and gas operators drilling exploration wells off West Coast Africa. The learnings that you get from that activity are market sensitive, and so you're not going to put them out there immediately. But depending on the environment you're operating in, you will have to make that data available to a regulator. In the UK, it's Nick, but the regulations are different in different locations. So Nick presented a picture for the UK which looks relatively clean and simple, but a company like mine operates in different locations around the world where the regulations can be very, very different. And in some cases, if you're not very careful around what you do with the data, for example, in China, regulations around seismic data, if you take it out of the country on a pen drive or your laptop, you're going to prison. It's really, really serious. They are very serious about their data being their data. So for an organization like mine, trying to understand the global environment, microphone, trying to understand the global environment is really challenging. And then there are data sets where I know that my company maintains it, BP maintains a copy, ExxonMobil maintains a copy, and we have to get quickly to those things which are almost like common data foundations and just say those are non-commercial. Let's collaborate around building the standards that get us there. And that's where I see the open source world being really exciting. It's a fantastic way to getting to standards. Now, it turns out all three of us come from a finance background because I'm also an ex-accountant. 10, 12 years ago.
I'm not.
Oh, you're still?
Non-accountant.
They're going to start throwing eggs at us, Ian.
Two of us are. But I remember back in my early days where studying finance, and so 25 years ago, maintaining data sets like exchange rates. I would key exchange rates into a SAP system, and occasionally I would transpose a couple of digits and it would make the numbers go really crazy.
Oh, we call those fat finger errors in banking.
Well, we don't have them anymore because we now pull the data from an API.
Sadly, we still have them in banking because traders still key things in.
And we thought you guys were the leads in this space. Oh, well. but it's trying to figure out within an industry, where can you focus on, I'm going to say, collaborative development of open source technology that allows us to differentiate between the commercial, sensitive, must keep secret for a period and the stuff that's just better done through collaboration. And I think there's so many parallels between what the finance framework has created and what we need for energy. And it's not just the legacy energy piece around oil and gas, it is the transition piece and the climate change and the emissions challenge that we're facing. I feel a bit guilty here. I didn't bring a Shell branded shirt today. I know everyone's got their stickers and their swag. I come to these events a little bit, this could be a bit difficult because my industry is seen as being the bad guys. But we're also investing huge amounts of money in the energy transition and trying to understand how do we grapple with the emissions challenge, because it's not just a Shell problem, this is a society problem, it's a big one. what our open source community is really good at, solving these kind of really big problems. So there's kind of a plea to everyone here today. We haven't got all the solutions. Work with us to help find out what they can be.
So interestingly, as a banker, one of the things that I would say about Shell is that it's well known within the research community and the banking analysts that they are really transitioning to being an energy company from an oil company. And I actually think that was one of the reasons why I reached out to you, because I thought somebody who's not just about making money, which sadly is what most bankers are about. Nick, you mentioned in your own talk about data isn't necessarily competitive in this space, it's commodity. And apologies, Ian just touched on the fact that in some cases it is competitive. And again, I would say in banking there is data that is competitive as well. So, challenge me. Why is everything a commodity, or how could everything be a commodity in this space?
So commodity for some people sounds like a bad word, but what we're actually talking about is adding value. So if we're a regulator, I said at the beginning, but we regulate in a different way. So one of the ways that we saw that we could add value was to break down the barriers and those silos that I talked about earlier, in terms of once a licensee, so Ian's company, for example, submits data to us, they no longer have to retain that data. So that data is then maintained in our platforms. We've got over 1 petabyte of data, 96% of it is publicly available. So we're not making all data available to everybody instantly. So the seismic was the question before. So seismic data gives you a really good understanding of rocks. I'm not going to go further than that. I'm not a geologist. It's very, very expensive to shoot seismic data. And there are also now areas in the UK waters where you can no longer shoot seismic data for environmental reasons, or for the reasons that part of the basin is being used for something else. So if we can break down those barriers and say, okay, you've had a sufficient amount of time to add your own in-house value from that, we're now going to make that data available to academia, to other companies who perhaps don't have the weight of investments behind them that the larger companies have, but they're perhaps PE backed and they're coming into the market. They've got really innovative technology. We want that technology in the basin. If we can break down those barriers as the regulator by making the data available, then it effectively has become a commodity. But I'm using commodity as a positive word, that quite often, and I hope there aren't too many lawyers in the room, as I say, there's quite often data sharing can be tied up in legal frameworks and legal barriers and people wanting to go down into the great detail. And by then you've lost the value that you could have added from using that data in an innovative way. So for me, it's just making sure, of course, we protect the commercial interests of organisations who have put investment into the basin, but actually after an amount of time saying this is now more valuable for UK PLC as a whole, or the world, because our data the data we hold is freely available globally. You can log on and across the world and look at it. If we can break that barrier down, then it effectively becomes a commodity.
It's interesting, your point. Yeah, of course, go ahead.
So this is a really, we could have this conversation in a bar or over lunch for hours, but we haven't got
With
that
beer?
much time
Fine,
today.
I'm there.
But Nick, you mentioned you've got about 1 petabyte of data for NSTA. So Shell has about 14 petabytes of subsurface data globally, and you can just extrapolate that across the industry. It's a huge amount of data. So imagine if we didn't have to store all of that data. Well, the cloud providers would be a bit upset because they make money out of storing our data, but they also consume electricity to store that data in their data centers, which creates emissions which we're all trying to battle against. So that kind of opportunity to collaborate and find where is that positive commodity view of data, that's the kind of thing we should be collaborating on more.
Well, and actually, I was going to pick up on that, because the point you made about everybody brings the data in, and then they don't need to store it, and then you effectively information barrier it when it's appropriate, is actually really an interesting thought. Because again, so UBS Investment Bank, when I was there, the head of research once said to me, I kept asking him, why were his costs going up so much? And he said, we have 17 yottabytes of data. And I literally had to sit down and think that through for about 10 minutes to think, oh my God, what are we doing with all this stuff? And again, when I went through the data sets with him, a lot of it is stuff they ingested from publicly available sources. And they had to ingest it because they couldn't trust that it was going to be there. So that idea of a central body, whether it be the North Sea Transition Authority or whether it be an open source community, being able to hold some of that information under some sort of agreement or license or structure that would allow us all to collectively contribute to it and be maintainers of it and know that it would be there, is the thing that would make the shift, I think, right? And again, then if I can take that and tie that back to something you were saying earlier about the work you do with the ODSU and the industry. So you and I were talking before this about this idea of the importance of information sharing, right? How can you see that working, say, even just within your industry sector, right, where you don't create cartel issues or you don't create monopoly issues? Because, of course, aside from the Chinese maybe wanting to throw you in jail for taking country data out of the country, if you're actually creating a monopoly, they're going to go after you like they announced they were doing to Google last night. So how do we bridge that gap?
Yeah, that's a really good one. So there are lots of things that the energy industry should be very, very proud of, and rightly is, and one of those is around safety. If you think about what the industry does, you know, we go to some pretty difficult parts of the world and we drill very deep holes into flammable resource, and then we produce it over decades and we try and do it safely, and we don't always succeed at that, so things do go wrong. And when they go wrong, people get injured, the environment gets polluted, and then there's a lot of repair work required afterwards. So one of the things that we therefore have to do is we have to have information that allows us to respond to incidents when they happen. And you know, go back a few years to what happened in the Gulf of Mexico with BP. You know, a part of the challenges they faced around responding to the Macondo disaster was not having the information they needed to know what they'd actually installed. Now, that may have been put in place decades ago. Some of the North Sea infrastructure is very, very old. It goes back to the 70s. Why would we not share that kind of information across the industry? Well, we do, so that we can respond as best as possible. And so I think what we should now be pivoting towards is something similar to that. We don't compete on safety is a tagline the industry has adopted. We collaborate to try and reduce the risk that people stay safe and the environment doesn't get harmed. Why couldn't we do the same thing around data? And so we've begun doing that. We don't compete on data foundations, and that's why the OSDU forum is being successful. It's an open source group coming together saying, we know that the basics around how we ingest, store, search for data, it's a common foundation that we can all just benefit from building together. You can't build it alone. You can't solve the problem with one company, so you have to get in a room and work it out. And then that becomes really interesting, given some of the conversations I heard in the plenary this morning, that boundary between the collaborative open source and the commercial space. We thought naively when we began this journey it would be a nice clear line. On this side you're collaborating, on that side you're competing, and it turns out not to be the case. And the line starts to move over time as well. And so we haven't yet figured out how to play that balance between where do we collaborate, where do we compete. And that's where the opportunities are as well. So lots of people are finding, startups finding space to make a commercial margin in that grey area. I would encourage more people to come and try and find that, because we probably haven't got the answers.
So it's interesting because I think in banking, about 12 years ago, we did try that. So we looked at collaborating across operational functions, across things like corporate actions, in an effort to save money so that we didn't have to pass charges on to the customers. And the irony there was that the regulators looked at that as anti-competitive and monopolistic. And actually in Ireland, all the banks got together to actually create those shared service centres, and then were told very categorically, no. Now, I get that's business process rather than data, but again, I think I'm going to pivot back to you again, Nick. I think if we look at it with a regulatory lens on, you know, what do we do to sort of challenge, I guess, the culture and the mentality and the skills that we need to break that mindset so that we can become more collaborative?
So I mentioned earlier, STEM-based industry, only a third felt they had digital and data skills for emerging technologies. That's quite scary. So if you're talking to people about data, firstly, most people in a room, not this room, switch off. They don't really know what you're talking about. You start talking about data portals, they think you're talking about a filing cabinet and you're putting some files into it. It sounds really dull, they switch off. those same people, whoever they might be, are fantastically interested about AI and the metaverse. For example, Lee and I were talking yesterday about the kind of cycle of things you get asked around the board table. This year it's AI, or last year it was AI. A few years before that it was the metaverse. Then it was blockchain. Then it was an app. We need an app for that. So you go through these cycles of the words that people know, that they're happy to talk about. But the underlying thing with all of those technologies has been data. And if the digital and data skills are not there in a STEM-based industry, that means that they're not there across the UK. So I think for me, as a regulator, our direct role is not in terms of skills. However, it's so important that we're moving into that space, because without the skills being in place, then you have these conversations about, well, we're not going to bring data together because it's anti-competitive. Well, actually, it's not anti-competitive. If you do it in the right way, with the right frameworks, the right portals, the right structure, then that can actually add value. So we as an organisation have in the past called ourselves a value creator with regulatory powers rather than a regulator. And that's just to try and get across that regulation sometimes gives you the ability to bring people together, but you still need those key skills for people to understand why you're opening up those conversations.
So I think in the plenary this morning, Lord, we talked about the need to open government, truly. So I guess one of the questions I have, because I've struggled with this myself, is I've actually had very good relationships with regulators around the world in the last 20 years in banking, because I'm not quite normal. I'm certainly not a typical banker, and I'm quite happy to share the information with them to try to get to a common ground. But that's a step removed from the legislators. So do you have any advice on what we can collectively be thinking about in terms of, how do we help the lawmakers potentially develop the understanding?
So don't talk about data, talk about the outcomes. So the story I talked about earlier of taking data and using that to enable people to site offshore wind farms. If you've got a policy objective of net zero, showing how you can achieve that and the outcomes is important, not talking about data. So if I'm talking to someone in the non-data world, I try to avoid using the word data at all, because it turns people off. They're not interested in it. So I think showing how something can be made easier and the outcomes from it are how you win the policy argument. So one of the ways we've been able to collect that petabyte of data I mentioned was by creating regulations and legislation. So Ian's team is required to submit the data to us. And the feedback we had from the data management teams and the IT teams was that actually that was really strong. For the regulator to have legislation means that those teams get more funding, because head office says, well, you've got a regulatory requirement that you need to fulfill. So using the regulation in a different way than perhaps people have traditionally envisaged, I think is really important.
So that's an interesting one, because I think one of the many hats that I've worn, and again, I guess I didn't set a scene in one sense, so I can understand why everybody thought maybe I was an accountant. I've always been a nerd. So I started in tech. I started writing algorithms when I was a kid, and using data to figure out how to make things happen. Because of course you can't have an application without an input if you want an output. And to me it was always very simple. And I agree with you, because I think in my dealings with the regulators, I've always tried to think about analogies, right? And how do I put it in their terms? And I do the same thing with my board when I work for various banks, instead of talking about data, you talk about the information. What's the information or the insight that you need to actually make an accurate business decision? Because as soon as you say data to the CEO of a bank, he immediately thinks it's a tech problem, right? Go talk to the CIO, go talk to the nerds, I'm not interested. And it's such a lost opportunity. But I find that, interestingly, with my interactions with regulators and legislators, it's kind of the opposite. Because these people are actually very intelligent, very specialist in their own ways, but they don't understand the space. Unlike your CEO who has a fear of missing out, the legislator or the regulator actually wants to learn. And we heard it earlier in some of the plenaries where, the EU passed some legislation, now they're trying to realize maybe they need to refine it, and they're actually listening to the open source community about it.
And a regulator or a policymaker is always going to find they've got a stronger argument if they've got data behind it. So if you can show people that, then I think that's really important. So since we've been around for 10 years, and as part of our setup, one of the reports that essentially set us up said that the industry and the organisation needs to be data-driven. So that was 10 years ago. That was let's talk about Gen AI and all of those kind of things. Data has been consistent in what we do. We bring the managing directors and chief execs of the 20 larger companies into a room annually, and we show them benchmark data on their performance across a whole range of measures. And actually bringing that to the table with MDs is really important. They're not the data managers. They're not the IT folk. They can actually see in the room how they're performing against others. And they say, where did you get this data from? We said, you. You have submitted it to us. It's your data. We've done the data and analytics on it, and we are sending it back to you guys. But you need to take that and use that to do something useful with, whether that's reducing emissions or whether that's energy security. The data is there.
Okay, I'm conscious of time. Even with our revised schedule, I think we've got about 8 minutes. So we definitely have more we could talk about. But I would like to see if anybody in the room would like to ask a question on the topic to anybody on the panel. Okay, he had his hand up first, and then I will come to you. Sorry. Could you tell us maybe your name and where you're from?
Sure. My name is Amin. I work at an energy company called Connex. Nick, you mentioned that you use regulations to drive data openness. That's what if you're non-regulator? So I was just wondering how maybe Ian incentivizes data share. As a non-regulator body, how do you incentivize other companies to share data?
So I'm going to repeat the question for the video just because I don't think it would have gotten picked up. So it's a question from a colleague in an energy company who is asking, Nick talked about how we share data and how we do it, but the question was more directed to Ian in terms of, as a similar person in the same industry, how would you incentivize it?
So I think there's a carrot and there's the stick. And when the regulator says you must do this, it becomes a compliance matter, and then there's no choice. And that that can be effective to a point, but then the company sees it as it's an overhead, it's a burden, it must be done as cheaply as possible, and over time you just try and reduce it down to as small a burden as possible. And that's okay, it's very effective, and it's probably necessary in some cases. And it's the reality in many cases. I think there's the flip side as well, where you can use the carrot to create the incentive to want to do something because there's a payback, there's a quid pro quo. And I think in the way the industry is evolving, I mean, we know that we're not going to be drilling oil wells for much longer. How long that's going to be will be driven by society's demands, and that will play out. But we know that the future of energy is going to be cleaner, greener, needs to be secure, it needs to be affordable. It's a big challenge. And I think across the industry, people are looking at things like carbon capture. If we can find better ways of sharing data and then using open source approaches to find out where carbon capture plays might be in the future, we reduce the burden, the cost burden of actually doing the activity ourselves. So it helps us with doing our future business. I think it's about painting that, it's about public-private partnership when it comes down to it. How can the regulator, the government, public and companies come together and say, to achieve the long-term macro goal, which is safe, secure, reliable, affordable, clean energy, how are we going to use our data assets and how are we going to enable that through technology? And I believe deeply that the way of enabling it through technology is more and more through open source. So I think this is really important for this room, for this group today. And it's a plea for help. We cannot do this on our own. We're really good at engineering wells. We're really good at shooting seismic data. We're not that good at open source technology. We're learning our way, but we need help from the wider community.
Thank you so much, Ian. She's next, and then here. Could you again share your name and where you're from, please?
Yes, so my name's Melissa, and I'm a co-lead for an initiative in the water sector, which is related to open data, for opening up data in the water sector. And I guess my question is for Nick. Sorry, Nick. Sorry. Is as we move more into cross-sector data sharing use cases, the regulators are not consistent. So you've been very proactive as the North Sea Transition Authority, as a regulator, for pushing open data and getting some good principles in place. But it's a very different picture across
So if I can repeat again for the camera and the people on the other end of the camera. So the question came from a colleague who is also a regulator in the UK in the water sector, and it was about how we can look across the different regulators to get some synergy, because I think the perception is that the North Sea Transition Authority might be further ahead. Is that accurate?
Yeah, it's very variable.
Very variable.
Depends which regulator you're looking at, really.
Yeah, so I should say, if you haven't spoken to our colleagues from Stream on the water industry, they're speaking last thing today, so I'm doing a little bit of a pledge for come along to listen to their story. I think we're not good enough, and I don't know whether I'm talking about public sector or wider just community, at learning from each other. So we see some definite good pockets of best practice across the regulatory sector. We don't tend to talk enough across the regulated sectors, so if we bring finance in it, in theory, we should be talking more to the banking sector there, as regulators as well. There are some great initiatives. So we heard earlier from in the plenary around the recent State of Public Sector Digital report, which alongside the AI Action Plan is building on the National Data Library idea. And that's at really early stages. I think it's great that the wider public sector are talking about areas where we should have the ability to access data. Now, whether that National Data Library is going to hold master data or metadata is yet to be determined. But I don't have a good answer. I don't think we talk enough, and I think that's why it's important that we reach out to the broader community, particularly around open source, to make sure that we are learning as regulators and as the regulated industries as well.
Is there an opportunity there, and I don't know, for something like the digital services team in 10 Downing Street to create a forum for UK regulators, just even if it was to bring you together once a quarter to meet each other and share ideas?
So there is the Institute of Regulation that was set up a couple of years ago, and that has a digital and data special interest group, so that's trying to do some of that. I think there's definitely room always for more people to be talking with each other. That said, we shouldn't just get in rooms and talk about it. We need to actually do some action on it as well.
Of course. So, George, journalist.
Hello, George Lawton. I'm a journalist for Diginomica. I was thinking about all this data that's out there. Like you mentioned, the 14 petabytes, presumably, that's all over the world. And then, you collect some bit of that. And I wonder, how do you think about what's proprietary and competitive advantage in like shareable for scientists or new technologies? And I know like there's the traditional, okay, there's oil here, there could be oil here if the technology improves. So, it's maybe we don't share that. And then you've got like these new, the new geothermal that's like much more cost effective than the deep wells. And that's sort of adjacent to your existing sort of experience. Like what are the kinds of conversations that you have with your team about, well, this might be worth sharing for science versus, future opportunities for Shell?
Okay, so again, sharing for the audience on the other end of the camera, a journalist in the audience had asked the question, how do you think about, within your teams, what information might be useful for sharing from a science perspective versus a commercial perspective? And I think that's a really good question, because again, we keep talking about regulation and regulators, but actually advancing scientific knowledge is probably more important. No offense, Nick.
Nothing's more important than that.
I think it's both, and this links to something that Nick was touching on. We need data and digital literacy in our organizations, whether they're regulators or financiers or companies, whatever sector you're working in, because things change, and they change so damn quickly. And I'm going to use a real example here. So hydrogen is a significant part of the solution to our energy future. But the infrastructure to produce it, to distribute it, to consume it is currently not really there. And creating it is going to be hellishly expensive. Like trillions of dollars of investment required over the next 10, 15 years to make it work. And no single organisation can do this, not the UK government, not Shell, not the energy industry. People have got to come together and figure out how do we build it. But for the last 40 or 50 years, oil and gas companies have been exploring for oil and gas and finding reservoirs that have got hydrogen in them and that was seen as a failure because hydrogen wasn't useful. And even reservoirs that have been produced for oil and gas have residual hydrogen left in them. Now, if we had all of the data about that at our fingertips, all you would have to do is invest in going and recovering that hydrogen. But the way that we used to manage data 20, 30 years ago was on pen drives and drives in people's desk drawers that got left behind. So a large part of the data that we've invested money in collecting is no longer with us. Now, the cloud gives us a future where that can be different. That's what we're trying to do for our industry. Get our data to the cloud so that you know what you've got, you know where it is, and it can be consumed and reconsumed by whoever. And maybe you get into an open sharing mentality where, okay, if the name of the game is exploiting hydrogen resources for the future energy solution, let's all get after it together. But once you've hidden it away in a desk drawer or something, it's gone. Then you've got a real problem. And that requires people to think with a data and digital centric perspective. What are we doing today that will be relevant in 5 or 10 years' time? Because, yeah, generative AI is brilliant, but if the data that you've got is garbage, you get some really cool hallucinations, but no real information. How are you preparing for the future when you're thinking 5, 10 years ahead? It needs people like this with this kind of mentality, but I don't have an answer for you. That's the challenge we're facing.
And I know we're at time, but just to add to that, so we've got over 160 academic universities accessing our data, which has been collected through the various companies. So we are definitely seeing a big academic research being the draw, which is how we're going to solve these problems, whether it's around hydrogen, carbon storage, the water industry. All of these different industries need academia to be on it as well.
So we have 2 minutes in total. 1 minute, I'm being told. I can't count properly. 30 seconds, Nick. You've got a room full of people here. You've got an entire community who are going to be watching this online. What is the one call to arms that you have for this group to help us advance this agenda? Because we're not the open source specialists.
Talk more about data outcomes than data itself. Try and convince the people you're talking about data without mentioning the word data. So a challenge. Talk about data without mentioning it.
That's the sort of thing I do to my kids. Ian, what about you?
I would say, please think about the energy challenge. It's everyone's challenge. I've got 2 children who are starting to be quite proficient coders. I'm not a coder, but I guess many of you are. Please think about the part you can play in the energy transition, because it's important for all of us, for the children, for the future. And open source is a key part of the solution.
And I guess, firstly, I'd like to thank Nick and Ian for joining me here and having the faith to join me here. I think we were all a little bit nervous. And thank you for nobody booing. My one call to arms, honestly, is that I think you can hear there's a passion up here from us as to how to try to figure out how to make data more open. It's going to save money. It's going to save data center space, which saves natural resources, which saves energy. The opportunity is huge. We really need some people like you guys collectively to help us figure out how we can, from our positions, help that happen. And we need the community to help us. So please do reach out. Thank you.